Yes. Greetings! I'm Aaron Balve. This is Mitren Guandao, secretly transmitted methods of the Guandao. This is my series for talking all things Guandao. In this video, I'm going to be talking about two questions. Were Guandao actually used? And were Guandao cavalry weapons? Now, the reason I picked these two questions is because these are ideas that I see pop up online now and again. Some people like to suggest that Guandao either weren't actually used in combat, or that they were used, but they were primarily cavalry weapons. And I think that there are good reasons for making these statements. There are sources that back up these ideas. However, Guandao have been around for a long time, several centuries at least, maybe 1,000 years. So while there may be good reasons to make these statements, there are also a lot of counterexamples that kind of complicate things. So let's start with the big question first. Were Guandao actually used in combat? So first I want to say that yes, Guandao were used at some point. Antique examples, however few there are, do show signs of use. So clearly someone was using these weapons at some point. Now I think when people try to make the argument that Guandao weren't actually used in combat, they're probably drawing from one particular source, or maybe one source, this source that gets quoted in lots of other places too. And that is from a early 17th century military text, Wubei ya畧. This was written by Mao Yuanyi, who focused on kind of water-based combat, and his text covers a lot more than just water-based combat, so it's still totally relevant for talking about the Guandao. So in this text, when he's talking about Guandao, he has this particular sentence that goes, 颜乐刀 以之操习是雄 时不可适于阵也. So that means something roughly like the Yan Yue Dao, or the Guandao, another name for the Guandao. When it is used for training or practice, it appears quite awesome, quite impressive. But in actuality, it is not usable on the battlefield, or something like that. So obviously the second part of that phrase, the one that means something like, in actuality, it wasn't usable on the battlefield, or it could not be used on the battlefield. That's kind of the key part of this phrase that relates to the argument. But before we get into that, I want to take just a quick detour on the first part of the sentence, which is 以之操习是雄. So that's when it is used for training and drilling, it appears very impressive, or something like that. I'm going to point this out because this is something that comes up in a lot of texts related to Guandao. So for example, another text from the 17th century, a little bit later, the ge粤东. This text is a really wonderful Guandao text. It includes an entire form, and it talks about how it is used in particular contexts. So it presents stances and then tells you how to use each stance and what you do with your opponent's weapon. You know, it's certainly very useful, gives a lot of good information. But in the introduction to the Guandao section of that text, the author says something that's a little bit similar. He says that, you know, there are lots and lots of people, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands, or I'm not sure how many, but there are lots and lots of people who are practicing with Guandao, and they look really great, but they can't actually fight with it. But then he goes on to say that if you study my method, you will certainly be effective. You will certainly obtain victory. So, you know, he's saying, all those other guys don't know what they're talking about. They might look cool, but they can't actually fight. But me, I can actually fight. My technique is good. Sound familiar? That's like 90% of YouTube videos on martial arts. Guys telling you that their method is the only one that actually works. So, I mean, my guess is that, you know, that wasn't actually the case. Not, you know, he was just kind of, the author of Jing was just kind of selling his method, saying it's the only one that was effective. But it's kind of interesting because it really does echo that first sentence in the Wubei ya畧. It's just saying that at the time, they certainly were practicing with the weapon, and practicing with the weapon certainly looked cool. So that's something I think we should keep in mind, because it's this recurring theme in a lot of texts about Guandao. Okay, my little detour is over. I'm going to circle back to the Wubei ya畧and look at that second part of the sentence, 时不可适于阵也. So in actuality, you cannot use it on the battlefield. So I think that's what a lot of people are referencing when they're bringing up this idea that Guandao weren't actually useful in combat. But it's a little strange because there are a lot of other texts that said they were useful in combat. So like about a century earlier in the 16th century, there's the text, the Jishao Xinshu by Qi Jiguang. So this text talks about the use of dadao, which, okay, put a pin in it. Dadao is a term that is often used for Guandao. Maybe it could be used for other weapons too, but for now, I'm just going to assume that this is talking about Guandao or weapons that are very similar to Guandao. So it's talking about how the Guandao was used in formation with the langxian. The langxian is this really great weapon, which is basically a big tree, a big bamboo tree that hasn't had all of the leaves and branches cut off of it, and then they add spear tips to it. So it's like a great big spear that's basically just a tree. And so the way the formation works is that you have your langxian kind of in the center towards the back a bit, and then you have soldiers in front of the langxian who are equipped with swords and shields, and they protect the guy with the langxian. And then on the sides of the langxian, you have soldiers with spears who also kind of attack and provide more offense to the defensive langxian. And then on the flanks, then you have warriors who are equipped with tridents and dao polearms and dadao or guandao. And so these kind of so you have your long reach weapons in the back, you have your sword and shields in the front, and then you have your big two-handed artillery swoop in from the flanks. If you're interested to learn more about langxian, I'll highly recommend a video from the Scholar General. I'll put a link in the down below. So here's an example from a text that's only slightly 100 years earlier that's talking specifically about uses of the weapon on the battlefield. So it's in direct contradiction with the sentence from the Wubei Zhi. So you could say that since that text is earlier, maybe the Guandao was useful at that time, but then had phased out by the time the Wubei Zhi was written. Except that there are other texts from even later periods that also talk about the Guandao being useful in combat on the battlefield. So that brings us, then that's going to lead me into the second question: were the Guandao primarily cavalry weapons? And the source of this idea, I think, comes from one text called the Wubei要畧, and I've talked a lot about 武备要畧 on this channel. 武备要畧 is another 17th century text written kind of after Wubei Zhi. 武备要畧 does not even address the question of whether or not the Guandao was useful, but it does specifically say that the Guandao was practical for cavalry, but not for infantry. So he says that for infantry, it's impractical because the assumed opponent against the Guandao was somebody with a long spear, which made sense. Long spears were very common and very effective in combat. So he said that if you go up against somebody with a long spear and you hook their weapon out of the way, if you're able to deflect them, you still have to roll or twist or cross your feet. You have to close the distance. You have to sweep the spear out of the way, and then you have to close the distance. So the implication there is that is not something easy to do, so the weapon isn't practical for infantry. For cavalry, he says it's useful, and the way he suggests using it is that you kind of turn to make it look like you're running away from your opponent, and then when the opponent gets close to you, you quickly turn and chop them. So apparently he found that technique effective. And so that, again, this contradicts that original statement from the Wubei Zhi that Guandao weren't effective on the battlefield, when these other texts, the Jishao Xinshu by Qi Jiguang and the Wubei Yao Lue, they're saying that, in fact, it was useful on the battlefield. So there's another genre of texts here that I want to talk about. The texts I've talked about so far are all these kind of military treatises, which are sources that we use a lot in historical martial arts, and it makes sense to use them because they're explicitly talking about martial arts, they're explicitly talking about warfare and how weapons are used and things like that. So it makes a lot of sense that we would look at these texts. But they are not the only texts that give us information. So I want to talk a minute about Debunking, local gazetteers. This is a completely different kind of text, and it's not a military text fundamentally. So local gazetteers are these texts that were written. There are thousands and thousands of local gazetteers, and they were written all over different places of China throughout the imperial period, and each one is talking about a particular place and a particular time. And they were usually written by officials, so people who were sent from the central government to who knows where, out off in the towards the borderlands, or towards the towards the north, towards the south, towards the east, not towards the east, but that would be the ocean, I guess. But all over the country, to remote parts and wherever, and or to big cities alike. And these texts were written by the officials, so from kind of a central perspective about a local place, and they would talk about different things that are relevant in the area. So they would talk about local resources, they would talk about the local economy, they would talk about geography, they would talk about famous people from the area. Sometimes they get really cool, like ghost stories and like local traditions from the area. So these are great resources because they give you a kind of a central Chinese perspective on the rural parts, on the kind of the diverse local culture that we get in China. And so these texts are not military texts, but occasionally they do contain military matters because they want to tell you, the central government, or they want to tell people from outside the culture about the area. So sometimes they talk about military things. And these texts are hard to find. Fortunately, there are some databases now that give you kind of compiled. You can search for different terms if you're able to gain access. They're hard to gain access to, but you can search for particular terms in these local gazetteers, and even if you have a topic that isn't super common to come up in these texts, there are so many of them that you can still find you can still get a lot of hits and find a lot of information. So I've only kind of done casual searches about Guandao in Debunking. Hopefully in the future I can talk about them in more detail. But I want to talk about two kinds of anecdotes about Guandao that I see in these local gazetteers. The first of them is kind of a more literary one, and this is that Guandao often come up in these texts talking about biographies of local heroes. So they'll be talking about some, famous local general, or sometimes local bandits even, and they'll be talking about, they'll be describing how impressive they are and things they did. And sometimes they'll throw in a sentence where they said, oh, he could even wield a 30 jin Guandao or a 16 jin Guandao. Or they'll just say that he's really good with a Guandao. The idea is just, showing how big it was and how strong that must have been. So this is, again, I find this kind of echoing back to the Wubei and the ge粤東of talking about how impressive the weapon is, in practice, or, so people have this perception of the weapon being very impressive and looking really cool. So in this instance, when it's being used in biographies of local heroes, who knows how true it is? It could be complete garbage. It could just be kind of this literary device to make them seem cooler. But at the very least, this gives you an idea that the general people's perception of the weapon was that it was really impressive, and it was for strong, important people. The other anecdote that I see pop up kind of frequently in these local gazetteers is much more relevant to our current our current discussion, and that is it appears in lists of weapons. And so the context of these lists isn't always the same. It's like sometimes the list is explaining the weapons that had been sent to the area from the local or a higher level of government. So maybe the province sent them this, or the central government sent them these weapons, or something like that. Or it might just be describing kind of the armaments that are held at a particular local place. We're not talking about armies that are in the thousands. We're talking about armies that are in the hundreds, or maybe even not much more than 100, maybe in the tens and stuff like that. So they're kind of shorter lists of the weapons that are available to the local military units. And so, the list will just say there are 200 swords and 200 shields and 250 long spears and this and that and this and that. And sometimes Guandao appears in these lists. And when it does, more interesting is that it still seems like an important weapon. So if you have 200 swords, and you might have 250 long spears, but then you also have 200 dadao or Guandao. So, the fact that the Guandao appears in these lists fairly regularly suggests that it was being used to some extent in these areas. And it's not marked with an asterisk saying that it's a practice weapon only. And very often, sometimes the list is even divided into cavalry and infantry. But I've never seen it listed as a cavalry weapon. It's usually in with the infantry weapon, or the list doesn't distinguish between the two. So here's an example of a different kind of text that provides us some pretty useful information on Guandao. And that's kind of what I want to conclude this video with. So first of all, I'll walk it back a second and just say that, yes, Guandao were used. Were they used consistently from the time they first appeared, several centuries ago or maybe 1,000 years ago up until the present? Of course not. As firearms became more common, all of the so-called cold weapons started to be used less. And generally speaking, a sword and a shield or a long spear is going to be much more practical in combat than a Guandao is. So it's not as though Guandao was used consistently all the time from when they first started to appear to the current, into the 20th century, into the modern period. But they do appear to have been used throughout that time period to a greater or lesser extent. And were Guandao a cavalry weapon? Well, they were in the Wubei yaolüe, so definitely some people thought they were cavalry weapons. But there are plenty of other texts that just present them as infantry weapons. So while I think that both of these ideas, the idea that, maybe Guandao were at least at times more for practice than for practical application, that's probably true, at least sometimes in some places. Were they more cavalry weapons than infantry weapons? Well, to some people they were. But when you look at kind of the broad situation, there are clearly examples that contradict that idea. So that's all I have for today. I hope you found the video interesting. Maybe you disagree, maybe you don't like some of the way I interpreted some of the text, or maybe even better, maybe you have some other counter evidence you want to offer me. Maybe, other texts that talk about Guandao being used specifically as cavalry weapons, or other texts that talk about Guandao not being effective in combat. I'd love to hear more of those anecdotes as well. And other than that, until next time on 秘传 Guandao 法 secretly transmitted methods of the Guandao.